Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to my Mythic Plus Melee DPS tier list. If you're interested, I already made one for tanks, and there's also a video that'll be in the description that explains what each of these tiers mean, if you're interested in knowing exactly what I mean when I'm talking about each of these different tiers. So let's start off with the S tier. And in the S tier, we have the Outlaw Rogue. The Outlaw Rogue, since Season 2, has been solidly in the S tier, ever since they added the Keep Your Wits About You trait to the spec. It has just phenomenal single target and AoE damage in Mythic Plus these days. Single target used to be a little bit of a weak spot, but that now it's fantastic. One of the nice things about Outlaw and Mythic Plus, damage-wise, is that you don't really have to specialize. The same talents and traits and everything are best in slot for both AoE and single target, because Blade Flurry basically makes you turn your single target damage into AoE damage. So there's like one talent you change, one trait you put on, and then everything else is perfect for single target and AoE, which means that they're just really well suited to damage in a Mythic Plus environment. With the advent of essences, Blood of the Enemy in particular, they also have this very bursty characteristic to their damage that didn't used to be, like Outlaw didn't used to really have cooldowns, but now it does also, so it can kind of adapt to the new bursty meta of like bursting down emissaries in some pulls as needed. So that's the damage side. The damage side for Outlaw is very good. Like damage alone, it would be up in the A tier. Now, moving it into the S tier, the main thing is the Shroud, the utility that comes from Shroud of Concealment. All Rogue specs get this, but Outlaw is the best spec for other reasons, so it is the best Shroud available in the game. Shroud lets you skip tons of enemies in all kinds of dungeons. It lets you do it without spending time using reses. It lets you do it without accruing the death penalty or using battle reses. And it lets you do it once every 6 minutes per rogue in your group, which is a very short amount of time. So in general, this means that if you have rogues in your group, you're going to have an easier set of pulls in the dungeon than if you don't have rogues in your group, and that is worth bringing them up into the S tier. Other things that rogues have going for them, Outlaw Rogues in particular. Defensively, they're fantastic. They have a cheat death, which is effectively an immunity against a lot of attacks. Like as long as their cheat death's up, they can't get one shot by most things. They have parry for many. There are many abilities that parry is excellent against, and also if they happen to rip threat or something, or the tank dies, they can usually parry while the res comes out. They have Cloak, which is magic immunity, and that's huge in many spots. They have Vanish. Outlaw Rogues can use Vanish entirely for utility. They don't need it for damage at all, so you can just use it, and that causes abilities to retarget. You can use it to drop threat and res everybody after there's been a disaster of some kind. You can use it to facilitate even more skips when your Shroud isn't available, or when there's True Sight mobs that need to be skipped. So that's all fantastic. Then there's even more utility, though. Gouge and stuns. Outlaw can do all kinds of mob control. There are pulls in the Underrot where an Outlaw Rogue can take care of like stun the Feral Bloodswarmer, gouge the Maggot, kick the Lasher. An Outlaw Rogue can just do all of that in the same pull. That's pretty hard to do. That's a high skill, gameplay, which is it's really fun to do. But Outlaw can do it all. Not to mention that they have Blind and Sap, which are two fantastic hard CC options. And Sap is one of 2 crowd controls in the game that doesn't cause mobs to get in combat when you run next to them, which is really big for a number of spots in Mythic Plus. On top of that, they also have Tricks of the Trade, which is phenomenal on skittish weeks, but it's just good generally. It facilitates all kinds of like snap strategies that you see, where a tank goes and stands in a specific spot, and then the Outlaw trickses the mobs, and they'll instantly teleport to the tank. Tricks of the Trade is a huge part of how that works. So if you just think about like most of the affixes on the calendar, if there's an affix that a spec is good against, Outlaw is one of the specs that's good against it. Skittish, they have Tricks. Bursting, they have Cloak of Shadows. Bolstering, they have Sap, which is one of the few CCs that works really well against Bolstering. Explosive, Outlaw are among the best orb killers in the game. They actually gain overall damage from targeting orbs because that's an extra target for their flurries. So all in all, just an absurd spec. That the fact that this spec has all the other stuff and then gets Shroud on top of it. Shroud is the thing that puts it into S tier above just being high A tier, because there are a bunch of specs that have a great set of defensive and offensive options, but Shroud is just so big. In the A tier, this one is really close to Outlaw. Once you have one Outlaw Rogue in your group, I think it's equally as good as the second Outlaw Rogue would be the first Havoc Demon Hunter. So Havoc Demon Hunter also does very good damage and buffs your group's magic damage. In some comps, that doesn't really come up all that much because there are a lot of comps that don't really do that much magic damage, but in some comps, if you're playing with like a Fire Mage, that's 5% extra damage to them. And that's pretty big, and it doesn't show up on the Havoc's details damage meter or whatever. It shows up on the other players, but the Havoc is the person bringing that damage. Havoc Demon Hunters have a bunch of defensive utility also. They take very little damage. They have reduced magic damage taken, and they do a bunch of self-healing. So often the effective amount of healing that actually needs to be done to a Havoc Demon Hunter is very low. For some fights like Galvazit and Heartsbane Triad, where these are kind of like HPS intensive fights, having a Havoc Demon Hunter in your group is really big because they are one less person that needs to be healed, basically. On top of that, they have Blur, they can dodge with Blade Dance, and they can even take an immunity with Netherwalk, and those are all excellent in various spots in Mythic Plus, and there are huge plays that can be made. Netherwalk and Taunt is a good combo on like Necrotic weeks as well. You can use that to allow your tank to reset their Necrotic stacks on boss fights, which can otherwise be very difficult for them to do. They also have a good amount of control. They have an AoE stun. They can talent into a single target stun. They have an offensive purge, which can be very useful in some dungeons, especially if you're playing like Alliance side and you don't have access to Arcane Torrent. That can be really useful in some spots. And they also have Imprison, which is the other crowd control that doesn't get you in combat when you run next to stuff. If you imprison something out of combat, you can run right next to it, you don't get in combat, and that can be really big. Groups that have like 2 or more rogue/demon hunters and have access to multiple sap/imprison effects, you can use that to skip all kinds of pulls that you would otherwise need to actually use like Shroud or a Res or whatever to get through. One cool thing that Demon Hunter also gets is that Metamorphosis actually comes with an immunity. Not many people know about this, but in the 1 second while you are leaping through the air with your meta, you're actually immune to a bunch of effects. So there are some cool boss fights where you can use this to get a big advantage. Like you can use it on Lord Stormsong if you meta right as he's casting the Ancient Mindbender effect, and it would have targeted the DH, instead it just doesn't go off. So that's a pretty cool little neat trick that it sometimes comes up. There are a few spots in dungeons where it's cool. Just a fun thing that I thought I would mention. But yeah, fantastic spec. The only thing that I like, if Shroud didn't exist, I think this would probably be this would be at least competitive with Outlaw to be the best melee spec in Mythic Plus. Also in the A tier we have Assassination Rogue. So Assassination Rogue, if Outlaw didn't exist, would be every group would have an Assassination Rogue. I promise you that. The Shroud, they also bring the Shroud. Damage is also very good from Assassination Rogues. It can be competitive with Outlaw. One thing that Assassination, it's either a strength or a drawback, depending on how you look at it, is that Assassination can kind of specialize their damage. We were talking about how Outlaw, you really don't need to make any choices because everything is BIS for you in both single target and AoE. With Assassination, that's not true. You can go into this like Echoing Blades build that does very good AoE damage, but then you lose some single target. You can go into like a Twist the Knife build where you do great priority damage. So when you're fighting 5 targets and focusing damage into one of them, you can do very good priority damage with that sort of build. Or you can play like just a normal kind of Shrouded Suffocation Mythic Plus build that will do pretty good single target and also reasonable cleave, but lower AoE than if you were heavy into Echoing Blades. So there's a bunch of different directions that you can take Assassination in Mythic Plus. The end result usually is that you'll, in general, like you might be able to beat Outlaw Rogues in one area of the dungeon, but Outlaw is just consistently excellent at everything. And Assassination, I mean, there are people who are succeeding with it, but it's harder. It's harder to do than Outlaw. You're giving up like the increased melee range, which is something I didn't even talk about when I was talking about Outlaw, but like Outlaw has an 8-yard melee range, and that is very good compared to a 5-yard melee range. That means that they can stand out of range of many boss abilities like Trothak's Whirlwind. Outlaw Rogues can just hit while Trothak is whirlwinding. Outlaw Rogues can spread. There are a lot of compositions these days that are all melee, and Outlaw Rogues, when you have mechanics that force you to spread, like Quaking or Runic Mark in the Heartsbane Triad or whatever, Outlaw can actually just max range and still be hitting in melee. And Assassination, you're giving up that benefit. Assassination also gives up Gouge, which is a pretty big thing, and they also give up Vanish for utility. I mean, you can save the Vanish for utility, but for Assassination, Vanish is an important DPS cooldown. And so, unlike Outlaw, they're not just able to kind of vanish at will. And they also have a longer cooldown on Vanish because they don't have Restless Blades lowering its cooldown every time they use a finisher. One thing Assassination does bring that Outlaw doesn't bring is Garrote Silences, which can be pretty useful, especially in places like Shrine of the Storm. Silencing in 3 casters and they'll just walk to your tank and start hitting them there. And their damage is also, they have good single target burst with Vendetta usually, which means that for specific enemies like Void Emissaries, that can be really useful here in Season 3. All right, the next spec in the A tier is Windwalker Monk. Windwalker Monk is a spec that you don't see all that often in live keys because there's a lot of difficulty associated with playing it. It's a spec that lacks the big defensive options that Rogues and Demon Hunters have. Like, it's not hugely tanky all the time like Demon Hunter, and it's not got a cheat death like Rogues. Windwalker Monk does have defensive options, but it's less likely to survive a mistake made by the Windwalker in a high key. So of players of equal skill, if you have a bunch of great but not world class players in a group, and one of them is playing Windwalker, that Windwalker is going to die like 10 times as often as the rogues and the demon hunters. You're just going to press like Whirling Dragon Punch or whatever, and 2 seconds later, while you're still in that animation, you're going to realize that you couldn't have done that where you were standing, and you're going to die to a ground effect or whatever that everybody else had time to move out of. So that's kind of the big problem with Windwalker relative to the specs above it. Its damage is very good. It brings Mystic Touch, which is going to increase the damage done by everybody in your group that's doing physical damage, and physical damage is much bigger part of most groups' damage than magic damage, so Mystic Touch is usually worth a little bit more than the Demon Hunter brand ability, the magic damage one. The big thing that Windwalker brings this season is Ring of Peace. Ring of Peace, we talked about a little bit, being one of the things that makes Brewmaster so great in the tanking slot. If you're not playing with a Brewmaster, or even if you do have one, the second Ring of Peace is not worth very much compared to the first one, but that first Ring of Peace is worth so much that that brings, I think, the Windwalker into the A tier. Definitely, if you're playing with like a Prot Warrior, Windwalkers really open up all kinds of like Emissary of the Tides, avoiding Ring of Pieces that save a lot of time or make a lot of pulls a lot safer or allow you to combine pulls that you otherwise wouldn't be able to combine. And those are the sorts of effects like Shroud of Concealment that save big amounts of time over the course of a dungeon because they reduce the amount of pulls you need to do in the dungeon. The last spec here is Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior is a spec that's kind of new in high-ish keys this season. It's, again, not super popular. These first 3 specs that we talked about here, the Outlaw, the Havoc, and... Okay, mostly just the Outlaw and the Havoc are in many groups. Every group basically has an Outlaw Rogue, and many groups have a Havoc. And then these other A-tier specs, many groups don't run any of these. And Fury Warrior, I think, is also pretty uncommon, especially this one. Windwalker sees quite a bit of play in the MDI, whereas Fury Warrior does not see even much there. It's very high damage spec, but one of the things that actually holds it back from MDI style keys, as compared to like higher keys on live, is that their damage is capped. Once you add a 6th target, Fury Warrior stops doing extra damage to it because their Whirlwind makes their next 2 melee attacks hit 5 nearby targets, but not 6. So when you're doing a big pull with 10 or 20 mobs or whatever, Fury is not doing any more damage than they would be doing on 6 targets, basically. And so they fall off compared to these other specs as the number of targets go up. But their damage is phenomenal on those low target counts, and that's pretty good in high keys. And the damage has been good this patch in particular. The essences have been kind to Fury Warriors. They are fairly tanky spec. They have a lot of health, so there are many abilities that are kind of one-shotty that might not one-shot Fury Warriors. And they don't have an immunity, but they do have Enraged Regeneration, which for the duration of that, like as long as Enraged Regeneration is up and the warrior is bloodthirsting, they're going to heal themselves for like 4 times their health bar over the course of that cooldown, so they're pretty unlikely to die during that defensive. Rallying Cry is also a big useful thing in some spots, like Static Shock on the first boss of Temple of Citralis, Tantrum on Kragmaw the Infested in the Underrot. These are places where giving your group a little bit of extra health actually can save lives and can be a very useful cooldown to have. So those are the things that Fury has going for it. All right, the first spec in the B tier is Unholy Death Knight. Unholy Death Knight's kind of the opposite of Fury Warrior in its damage profile, where it's fantastic as the number of targets gets really high. That's because Unholy has a build that scales quadratically with the number of targets in the pull. So that means that each extra enemy that gets added to these pulls increases Unholy's damage against every enemy in the pull, which means that when you're pulling like 20 or 30 mobs on top of each other, which was really common with like Reaping, but is not something you can do all that often in Beguiling keys, they do just phenomenal damage to everything, and they can blow up everything very quickly, and also do a bunch of damage to the boss if you're pulling stuff on top of the boss. So you'll see this in MDI keys where this is feasible, where you can set up these like massive pulls. In live keys, that's a little bit less common, so that build of Unholy does a little bit less, consistently awesome stuff. People playing Unholy on live are instead just doing kind of good general damage. Death Grip and Battle Res are the 2 big pieces of utility that Death Knights bring, and Unholy does have those, and that's good. They're also fairly tanky with Anti-Magic Shell and their Death Strikes even. Just Death Strike healing in their defensive is very big too. So they're fairly tanky. This is a different kind of tankiness than the rogues and the demon hunters have, where they're just like unlikely to die if they make a mistake. Unholy Death Knights are likely to die if they make a mistake, but if they're prepared for incoming damage, they're likely to be able to survive it, which is not true for some of the D tier specs that'll be on this list. All right, the next spec on the list is Retribution Paladin, also in the B tier. Retribution Paladin, there's a lot of good stuff going on for them. Sort of like Unholy, there were characteristics of reaping keys that were very, very kind to this spec that are no longer present. So their good burst AoE in wings is no longer as... I mean, they're kind of... It's pretty good. It can be useful, especially like there are times where burstiness is a characteristic of damage that is more valuable this season than it was last season. But the AoE nature of it is less valuable this season than it was last season. So the trade-off is kind of... it kind of evens out. That's because burstiness is good against emissaries, but there aren't these huge reaping waves where you want big AoE to hit them all. So they're kind of like fire mages in that, like, in their wings they do phenomenal damage, and then outside of their wings they do medium damage. They have a couple of good things going for them. Immunity and taunt, like demon hunters have, it's a potent combination. It allows them to help their tanks reset necrotic. It allows them to just save their tanks if they're dying, randomly against a boss, which happens in high keys. They also have Word of Glory, which is extremely potent against Grievous. So when you're playing a high Grievous key, having a Rep Pally in your group, it's, I think, the best off healer available for, to mitigate the effects of that affix. So a good choice, especially if you're playing with a healer spec that might struggle with Grievous in those high keys. All right, in the C tier, the first C tier spec is the other Death Knight spec, Frost Death Knight. Frost Death Knight kind of doesn't really have anything big going for it. Again, it has the Death Grip and the Battle Res, and they can talent into like absurd 2-target burst with chilling spree. So I think that's what the ability. It's the Conflict and Strife Major they can put on. Although they don't even usually run that in keys. They'll usually run just Blood of the Enemy or whatever. There's not too much else good going on for Frost in keys. Their damage. Like, the damage is okay, but not great. There are ways they can specialize it to be good. They can play Dragon or whatever and do huge AoE burst every few minutes. But overall, there's not really the big utility things that the specs in the A tier do bring. And their damage isn't, absurd like Fury Warrior damage can be in some spots. All right, the next spec in the C tier. This is a tough spec to categorize because it's Subtlety Rogue. Subtlety Rogue, relative to, like... It's a weird one because there are other rogue specs available, and so those rogue specs really outshine Subtlety Rogue. I wonder what the metagame would look like if Blizzard just deleted Outlaw and Assassination. I expect that many groups would have a Subtlety Rogue, so it's weird to put it in the C tier. It's kind of a tough one to categorize. Like, this one, the categorization should be taken a little bit with a grain of salt, because, like, I think it's just the fact that it brings Shroud and all the usual rogue stuff and tricks and cloak and all that stuff. Means that it maybe should be up in the A tier, but in practice, if you're trying to get into groups and you're playing Subtlety, everybody knows that you could open your talent window and switch over to Assassination or Outlaw, and you're choosing not to do that, and so they're not going to invite you because by choosing to play Subtlety, which is just like a strictly worse version of those specs, people will assume that you're just not taking the game as seriously because it would be so easy for you to instead play one of these better specs. So it's a weird one to categorize. I could see a good argument being made for it being as high as A, and in practice, the community treats it like it's an F because you could just be playing one of the better rogue specs. But yeah, this spec got gutted back at the end of BFA Season 1 after it was extremely overpowered for a long time, actually. And I expect this spec will continue to be balanced very low on damage numbers until they rework it, which I'd expect to come around in patch 9.0. And I'm a huge fan of Subtlety. I try to make Subtlety viable at least once a month, and it's tough. You burn bridges with whatever tank you play with whenever you do that. All right, next spec on this list is Feral Druid. Feral Druid also here in the C tier. This one kind of you could kind of describe this as a budget rogue. It's kind of like a rogue that doesn't bring Shroud. They do have a battle res. They do have a couple other neat points of utility. Their damage is not bad. In general, the damage is going to be worse than the good, like, Outlaw Rogue damage can be, but they can do competitive damage. It's just the utility suite is smaller than Outlaw Rogues, or than Rogues, and they bring slightly less valuable things. One of the problems with being like a DPS Druid spec is that you're very likely to be playing with a Resto Druid, and so the unique like Druid stuff you bring, Battle Res or Soothe and Tangling Roots, those sorts of effects are usually covered by the Resto Druid. So that effect kind of pushes DPS Druids a little bit lower in those groups. Although people do play people play Balanced Druids with Resto Druids from time to time, and that isn't an awful combination or anything. So it still can work to play 2 Druids in a group. It's just the second Druid is adding a little bit less value with those effects. All right, the last spec in our C tier is Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman. This is the first. This Enhancement Shaman and Feral Druid are both specs that could be played as, like, they could play range specs if they switch specs, and it's interesting that most of these specs that can be both melee or ranged, like most of the classes that can be both melee or ranged, the melee specs tend to do pretty poorly in Mythic Plus. I think it's because the class abilities in general are balanced in a different way for these hybrid specs. Like that's my guess as to why we see them so low on the tier list. Enhancement really doesn't bring anything big in terms of utility. They're very squishy against a lot of types of damage. They don't have an immunity. Their defensive is just a shield wall. It's a good shield wall. It's on a short cooldown. But there's a lot of cases where you can just not make a mistake and have a bunch of incoming damage, and the Enhancement Shaman is just going to die. They're going to try their best to live, and they're just going to die because there's not a bunch of ways they can choose to keep staying alive. Like many of these A tier specs just have a bunch of different buttons they can press if they get in trouble. And that's not something that Enhancement has going for it. Again, the damage profile for Enhancement is pretty good for Mythic Plus. There's a lot of good things going for them. They sim very well in AoE, but it's tough to be playing Enhancement when you could just switch to Elemental as well, and then you would get to be attacking from farther away. You'd still have your good kick, and you'd be doing as much, if not more, damage. Enhancement does bring a Earth Elemental, which can be useful in some pulls. It's sort of like a Balanced Druid's trees, but it's not the empowered Earth Elemental that Elemental Shaman get. So it's not like directly controllable by the Enhancement Shaman. So it can be a bit of a problem with affixes like Sanguine, or just when you need to move mobs in general, or when you need to have it do specific things. It has a mind of its own instead of being a pet controllable by the Shaman. All right, in the D tier, we have Arms Warrior. Arms Warrior is... There's a couple of things they have that are better than Fury's kit. Really, the main thing they have that might be a slight upgrade over Fury's kit is they have a parry instead of Enrage Regeneration. So parry is a less potent defensive cooldown, but it comes with the ability to like parry taunt specific enemies, and that can be useful, especially as we were talking about against things like necrotic bosses. Outside of that, there's really not much they have going for them that's better than Fury. They still have the good warrior things of like Rallying Cry, but there's really not much reason to bring them over a Fury warrior. They're not target capped like Fury is. Like they can do good AoE, especially with Bladestorm. But in general, their damage is lower. And one of the things that I kind of haven't mentioned with this tier list, if you're wondering like how these specs that are similar are making it into different tiers, it's often just that damage is a 5% damage difference or whatever is enough to bring a class up or down a tier. Survival Hunter is the final spec of our tier list today. You may have been, I wonder how many people were thinking, okay, Arms was the last spec, we're done with this list. But no, there is another melee spec. It is Survival Hunter. So Survival, ever since they were switched over to being a melee spec back in Legion, has really struggled to find a home. They have a home maybe in PvP, but in PvE content in particular, they've never really thrived. Survival does bring an immunity with Aspect of the Turtle, and that's useful. And they have some cool crowd control options. They have traps and stuff. But generally, you're just a melee version of a hunter. Like you choosing to give up your ability to attack targets from far away, and all you've gotten for the deal is a shorter cooldown on your kick, which is valuable. Like there are some group comps where that would be important, but in general, you're really not bringing all of these hybrid melee specs. Survival Hunter, Feral Druid, Enhancement Shaman tends to not have a class kit that's full of all these cool melee utility things like the A and S tier specs have. Because they also, those class abilities just don't exist in their class because they can also play ranged, and Blizzard doesn't like giving those abilities to ranged specs all that often. And so these hybrid specs really suffer as a result of that. So that's I think one of the big reasons that 3 of the bottom 4 specs here are those hybrid melee specs. All right, that's going to do it for my M+ melee tier list. Again, it's an opinion, it's not fact. You'll see we have an empty F tier, which is a nice thing to do. And I believe you can succeed with any of these specs. Even the ones in the C and D tiers, groups can do well with them. It'll just be harder than if you're playing with the A and S tier specs. You'll have less options against some pulls. So, keep that in mind. Again, is my opinion. It's not a fact. I've played many, but not all of these specs. And many of the specs that I haven't played with, I've talked to people that are very highly rated. Excuse me. I've talked to people that are very highly rated that have played those specs. But I could be wrong about some of these things. Sometimes, my opinion on specs changes. So if you have an argument to make for your spec, or you think that a spec is overrated, underrated, let me know in the comments, and I'd love to have that discussion. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.